One, I'm honored to be here, along with my other House colleagues on this conference committee. Earlier today, I didn't think I would make it. There were thunderstorms in the middle part of our country. I didn't think the plane was going to arrive in time. I think there's probably an apt metaphor there about the gathering fiscal thunderstorms that are going to be impacting the next generation. I heard the gentlelady from Connecticut speak very passionately about children. I know she's very passionate about these issues. But as I look at this budget, never in the history of our nation have so few voted so fast to indebt so many of our children. And I agree with the ranking member from Wisconsin. This is a historic moment. One day I'm going to have to face my now 7-year-old daughter and my 5-year-old son. I at least want to be able to look them in the eye and say, I was not silent when your Congress voted to mortgage your future and be the first generation in America's history to leave the next generation with less freedom, less opportunity, and a lower standard of living. I do want to talk, Mr. Chairman, a little bit about the numbers, but so many of your colleagues on your side of the aisle engaged in history lessons, I can't remain silent on the subject. Most of you spoke about President Obama inheriting a terrible economic situation, and I agree, he did inherit a terrible economic situation. But number one, he inherited much of it from y'all. Last I read in our Constitution, it is Congress, not the President, who ultimately determines the level of spending and thus the budget and thus the budget deficit. Article 1, Section 9 of our Constitution, if anybody cares to read it. Now, I've heard many Democrats accuse Republicans saying, well, you're in charge, you spent too much money. Yeah, I agree. I agree. But I kept good to my word and I fought it. And I took on my party leadership. And those in the Democratic Party who say that they want to be committed to fiscal responsibility, that they are aghast at the level of debt and deficits, maybe they should consider doing the same thing. Now, last I looked, and I did a little research on this, when the deficit was $300 billion and falling, the House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer called it fiscal child abuse. It's when Republicans were in control of Congress. Now, Speaker Nancy Pelosi of California, again, when Republicans were in control, a deficit of $300 billion and falling, said the deficit was immoral. It was immoral to heap these deficits on our children and grandchildren. And now, under your watch, the deficit has gone from $161 billion up to $1.3 trillion, and I believe the President is now proposing an extra $500 billion to add on to that for a 10-fold increase in the deficit in 2 years. Now, I didn't do my homework to know if that sets a congressional record or not, but Mr. Chairman, I'm sure it is up there. Now, we could talk a long time about the various policies that got us into this economic turmoil. I believe a lot of people in America believe that too many of our fellow citizens borrowed too much, they spent too much, and they couldn't pay it back. And now what has failed so many of our individual citizens, the Democratic majority in Congress wants to impose upon the nation as a whole, and somehow believes that this will solve our economic problems. As history of my guide, and I've watched this debate, I've researched this, I've listened to the debate closely, I've seen no example of any nation that has ever borrowed and spent its way into prosperity. I've seen no example of that, although we are clearly trying. $700 billion of bailout money costing every household in the nation $6,034. A $1.13 trillion government stimulus plan costing every household in America $9,810. A $400 billion omnibus spending plan, chock full of all kinds of pork barrel spending, costing every household in America $3,534. And now, on top of that, the Democrats in Congress were proposing the single largest budget in the history of our nation, adding another $31,032 per household. I mean, even before this orgy of spending and borrowing, our nation was headed for a day of reckoning. And don't take my word for it. Listen to the Federal Reserve, quote, "Without early and meaningful action to address the rapid growth of entitlements, the U.S. economy could be seriously weakened, with future generations bearing most of the cost." The former Comptroller General of the General Accountability Office, quote, "The rising cost of government entitlements are a fiscal cancer that threatens catastrophic consequences for our country and could bankrupt America," unquote. Now, I've heard the President, and I believe the President, when the President looked me in the eye and said he cares about reforming entitlement spending. And Mr. Chairman, we didn't meet until about an hour ago, but I take you at your word. I believe you're sincere about it. But in the years I've been in Congress, I've met a lot of sincere people who want to do something about entitlement spending, but it's always going to happen sometimes in the future, sometimes in the by and by. Eventually we'll somehow get around to saving the next generation from bankruptcy, and notwithstanding all the good intentions of this president and previous presidents and you, Mr. Chairman, and other Budget Committee chairmen, for whatever reason, it just doesn't seem to materialize. Now, when I talked about my children earlier, and I know I'm supposed to pay attention to my constituents first, but I think more about my family first. This is a budget that's going to triple the national debt in 10 years. If this is the President's budget, and both of you gentlemen have said you're embracing the President's priorities, it's going to triple the national budget in 10 years, costing taxpayers $148,926 per household. I mean, with the exception of World War II, as a percentage of GDP, we have never seen these levels of debt. This budget is going to create more debt in the next 10 years than in the previous 220 on a nominal basis. I mean, our nation has never seen this level of debt, and it may well bankrupt us. And again, as history is my guide, no nation has ever borrowed and spent its way into prosperity. We tried. We tried during the Great Depression. And listen to what Henry Morgenthau, who was FDR's Secretary of Treasury, said at the outset of World War II, 10 years later after the Great Depression, quote, "We have tried spending money. We are spending more than we have ever spent before, and it does not work. After 8 years of this administration, we have just as much unemployment as when we started, and an enormous debt to boot." That's our own history. Let's look at some modern history. Let's look at Japan's lost decade, when they had a real estate bubble burst in the early 90s, not dissimilar to our own. I believe they enacted 8 different stimulus bills over 10 years. They took on the highest level of debt per capita of any industrialized nation in the world. And what did they get for it? No job creation, no GDP growth, and after 10 years, their per capita income went from second in the world to 10th in the world. Maybe we could profit from their example. There was an article that came out in the New York Times a couple of months ago about it. And again, this is not Rush Limbaugh, this is the New York Times. Let me quote. "During those nearly 2 decades, Japan accumulated the largest public debt in the developed world. This has led many to conclude that spending did little more than sink Japan deeply into debt, leaving an enormous tax burden for future generations." The article went on to say, "Among ordinary Japanese, the spending is widely disparaged for having turned the nation into a public works-based welfare state and making regional economies dependent on Tokyo for jobs." Again, it's not economic theory I have, it's history. You cannot borrow and spend your way into prosperity. Now, I am concerned that as much as this budget spends and as much as this budget borrows, in some respects it gets even worse. I mean, the reconciliation debate, I think, has almost been exhausted.